there, and welcome to episode 13 of the OGV Media Group Let's Talk Transition series of podcasts. I'm Moray Melhuish, the founder and principal consultant at Annet Consulting. We help bring services and technologies to market and provide project management for the offshore renewable sector. I'm delighted to be with Adam Morrison today. Adam is UK Country Manager at Ocean Winds. Welcome to the podcast, Adam.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
Can you introduce yourself and Ocean Winds, please, Adam?
Sure. I'm country manager, as you mentioned, for Ocean Winds UK business. Ocean Winds is an international offshore wind developer, and we aim to develop and construct and operate offshore wind assets in a number of different markets. We were formed in 2020 by EDP Renewables and ENGIE to focus on the offshore wind market and to grow, which we've done quite successfully in the last few years. Nearly 17 gigawatts in our pipeline, and around a third of that is in the UK. So the UK and the Edinburgh office that we're sat in today is a key hub in the overall business.
Great. And what can you tell us about your UK portfolio then?
We've got a really interesting portfolio now, particularly off the back of ScotWind results last year. So we have a mixture of assets in different phases. So Moray East is operational, Scotland's largest fully operational offshore wind farm at the moment. Hot on its heels is Moray West, which is now in construction. So two projects in the outer Moray Firth that together will deliver nearly 2 gigawatts of power. But we've now got also a development pipeline, all located in Scotland, comprised of a site called Caledonia, which is predominantly fixed bottom offshore wind site near Moray East and Moray West in the outer Moray Firth, and two sites located just off Shetland. So very, very diverse portfolio. The Shetland sites will be floating. So mixture of technologies and mixture of different phases that all those projects are in.
Great. And Adam, can you give us a flavour for the type of budgets, the number of people? Tell us a little bit more about what it takes to deliver wind farm projects like this.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really really fascinating about offshore wind in particular. The amounts are staggering. So we're talking about £2 billion plus capital investment projects, and the spend even in the development phase, you're typically looking at tens into hundreds of millions just during the development phase of these projects. So staggering amounts of investment, and we can only do that successfully with the right people to do it. That's really at the core of what we do, I would say, in particular in our hubs like Edinburgh and Fraserburgh, where we've got the staff that develop and build and operate these projects. In the operational phase, you're probably looking at about 100 people dedicated to the site. So perhaps the numbers are not enormous, but I think where the benefit snowballs is that there's a whole secondary industry that these projects, once they're operational, create around about them, a bit of a local ecosystem that they build around about them. So there's a lot of jobs created in the areas where we operate our projects.
Okay, and we're here in your very impressive Edinburgh offices, Adam. Can you tell us about some of the roles that you've got here? How many people do you have here in this office?
So there's about 150 desks in this office, and it's full to bursting, particularly in the middle of the week. One of the main reasons for that is that with Moray West in construction, we've grown a construction project team, and that's a very large proportion of the people that are working here. But also development staff working on our new development pipeline like Caledonia and Arvin, and also some of the operations team. So we operate Moray East out of Fraserburgh in the northeast, but we also have staff here centrally who support that. And so the office is full to bursting, and that's been a big part of our success in the last couple of years, I would say, is we've grown from smaller office, maybe around 30 of us before Moray East went into construction, to about 150 here now.
Great, and what's the time scale like for delivery of these other projects? So you've mentioned Moray East, Arwen, Caledonia.
So the next on the horizon in terms of operational projects is Moray West, and we hope to have Moray West fully operational by 2025. So it's in the middle of construction at the moment, should start producing power next year and be fully operational by 25. We'd then like to deliver Caledonia by 2030. That depends on delivery of grid connections for all the ScotWind projects, but Caledonia we want to bring forward quickly. It's one of the only fixed bottom sites that was awarded through ScotWind, and we believe we can move fast with that site. The Shetland projects are more complex in their nature because they're very remote, and so we need to work with our partners on those projects to identify the route to market and the best way to bring those projects forward, which we're working on at the moment. But we're ambitious there about getting these projects delivered quickly. That's really what we're in the business of.
And Adam, how does your supply chain look for delivering these projects? You know, how many direct suppliers would you have for the construction of a wind farm, and what type of goods and services would they be for?
Traditionally in construction phase, offshore wind has been delivered on a multi-contract basis, but with a small number of large contracts, so wind turbines, foundations, cables, substations, broadly speaking. You might get a breakdown like that. But then there's a huge number, probably into the thousands by the time you complete a project. If you go through development and construction phase, into the thousands of smaller contracts that you'll award around the side of those. So we're interacting with, and another thing about offshore wind that I think makes it really interesting to work in is just the breadth of different supply chain capabilities that we need to draw on, from local legal services through to sort of international fabrication manufacturing contracts. Nowadays there's been a move towards progressively more multi-contracting, so that's something that we are doing, for example, in Moray West, but other developers are doing as well, partly because developers are building their capability and their experience and can multi-contract more, so awarding more and more tier ones, breaking things into smaller packages. And part of it is out of necessity as well. We're facing some supply chain constraints now because offshore wind is booming generally, so there's a lot of demand on supply chain, and that naturally pushes you towards placing more smaller contracts rather than more traditional model of a small number of tier ones.
Okay, can you tell me more about these supply chain constraints, Adam? You know, are there specific areas where you see shortages, for example, or challenges?
Yeah, it's complex, particularly at the moment because of world events, of course. But I think there's three I would pick out particularly: foundations, and that's largely driven by the scale now of foundations, whether that's fixed bottom or floating offshore wind. The scale is incredible, so there are a very small number of places that have the infrastructure and the people to fabricate steelwork on that sort of scale. Another example, and I think that this is very much a current day issue for the industry, both for construction and operation, is large vessels. Mm-hmm. Again, the scale of what we're installing now is enormous. Wind turbine technology keeps growing, which is what's helped bring cost of energy down. And so therefore there's quite a small range of vessels that can actually install the type of equipment that we're buying. So that is a present day constraint, but there is investment going into that, and new larger next generation class vessels appearing. And then the third, which is kind of often forgotten, and it's maybe not seen as being the most exciting bit of the supply chain, but I think is absolutely crucial, is electrical equipment. Even if you look away from the wind farms into our energy networks, we need to transform our energy networks around the world, and the scale of investment in transmission networks, so things like cables and transformers, is incredible, and I think that's another area where there is constraint, and that constraint could get worse if there is not early investment in the supply chain to deliver the transition in our energy networks, transformation.
Yeah. Okay, so the foundations, vessels and electrical equipment. Adam, do you see the same challenges in fixed and floating, or are they particularly magnified in one of them?
I think they're different. The challenges in relation to floating, which now need to be addressed in order to fully commercialise floating wind and deploy it at scale, predominantly exist around the foundations. So the type of port infrastructure that they require is different again from fixed bottom wind, and in particular the scale of the port infrastructure to allow floating wind to be delivered at scale is going to need a lot of investment. So I would say that's something that differentiates floating offshore wind, but it's also one of the things that presents an exciting opportunity, very exciting local opportunity as well in Scotland, stimulated by ScotWind. If we're going to deliver floating offshore wind at scale, we're going to need really significant scale of investment in our ports, and it creates a huge opportunity for those ports to thrive.
And do you think we've got enough local supply chain here to support you, or are there particular shortfalls in some of these areas? You mentioned bringing in international steelworks. Is that something that you would like to see change?
We certainly have constraints at the moment. There's no denying that, and that's a combination of infrastructure and people. So I think it's going to be really important that industry works together, and it's going to need collective effort from developers, and I think there is the will to do that. We've made public commitments in relation to our projects. There's the will amongst the developers, but developers, policymakers, and the supply chain are going to have to work together in order to address all of those constraints and to realise some of the opportunities. And we need to be realistic that it doesn't happen overnight. So I think something that's particularly crucial is that we can show pipeline visibility. That's one of the main things that the supply chain feeds back to us around what it needs in order to be able to make enabling investment, training people, developing their facilities. They need to see that we have a pipeline of projects and that we are going to deliver them, and that there's policy support that will allow us to deliver them.
Yeah.
And that's where policymakers come in, and that they can create the investment environment that gives people certainty that these projects will happen. And if that happens, then the supply chain can then invest.
Okay. And Adam, a lot of our audience are members of the supply chain, and of course I'm sure a lot of them would love to know how they can best engage with a business like Ocean Winds. What advice would you have for them?
I'll probably focus on the lower tier supply chain actually, because we have we've a relatively large pipeline, and that means that we deal with the tier ones on a very regular basis across our portfolio. And at any one point in time, we'll always be tendering in some way with the top tier of our supply chain. I think the thing that's more challenging, and therefore that we have to work hard on, is reaching the lower tier in our supply chain and making sure that they know when the opportunities are coming forward. That's something that's often mentioned to me as a barrier by smaller companies to getting into the sector, is understanding when and how they get in. And we're trying to do various things to help that. One on Moray West, for example, is running meet the buyer type events, not just with the project directly, but also with our higher tier supply chain, who are actually going to be the companies awarding a lot of the contracts. So trying to do more of that type of work that introduces the actual customer for services to their supply chain. We've been trying to do more and more of that recently, and also I think that there's now, and part of this has been triggered by ScotWind, but it happened already. Scotland has got a really vibrant industry events calendar, and so there's a lot of opportunity to engage through the trade bodies, for example. And so, some of these events now, again, particularly post ScotWind, are very, very well attended, and there's a really good opportunity for us as a developer to see what's going on in the supply chain, including some of the more innovative things that we might not see from day to day, but also for the supply chain to sort of naturally network with all of the projects, because there's lots of them. So it can be very time consuming. So
you mentioned your footprint in the northeast of Scotland in Fraserburgh. You must have quite a considerable footprint locally there.
We do. So we have an O&M base in Fraserburgh. We're developing a new O&M base in Buckie as well, so we'll have a hub across those two sites. But we've also built electrical infrastructure across two different sites, two different substation sites with different cable routes. So we've been present in that area now for more than 10 years, either engaging through the development of our projects or by building facilities and having offices and having presence there. So yes, we're building progressively bigger footprint, and that's what naturally happens as these projects go into operations. I think it's the long-term legacy they leave. So although we have a headquarters in Edinburgh in the Central Belt, the legacy that our projects will leave will also be long-term, really high-quality jobs in bases local to the sites.
Great. I presume that has led to a really positive response from the local community in the northeast.
I think so. I mean, it's natural that through the planning process there's some challenge as to what we're doing, and that's absolutely right. It's right that there's scrutiny. We're building really big infrastructure, including onshore, so there's a good level of scrutiny, and of course sometimes some challenge that we have to address. But I think particularly in the northeast of Scotland, I've found that people understand their energy infrastructure around where we're building our projects, and that has definitely helped us. Strong level of understanding of electricity networks, for example, underground cabling, substation construction. The communities around our projects have seen that before, and they have a connection with energy infrastructure naturally because of the nature of the north of Scotland. We've definitely benefited from that.
Great. And is there a secret to getting and keeping these local communities on side?
Lots of engagement from as early as possible.
Yeah.
I would say we're certainly trying to do that, for example, with our Caledonia project, which connects in a similar place to Moray East and Moray West. So early engagement and lots of it. Similarly, we're forming a project team now to work on the Shetland projects, and the first task for them really is to get out, meet people, understand the local communities and stakeholders we're going to engage with. So lots of communication and consultation from as early as possible. We've always tried to put a face to the name of our projects as well. You know, these are huge infrastructure projects, and they're typically well branded, and so there's a brand name that comes with these projects, but we try to put our faces to them, spend a lot of time locally, so that those in the area where we're building our projects get to know us too, and can speak to us directly, and I do think that we've benefited from that. That's always been how we've tried to go about what we do.
Great. And thinking about the impact of offshore wind more broadly, how do we address concerns around biodiversity?
I expect that we're going to face progressively greater scrutiny here as we deploy more and more. So there's cumulative impacts of what we do, and also floating offshore wind brings a different type of interaction with the environment in certain ways. So we can never rest on our laurels. But we're subject to quite a lot of scrutiny through the planning process. So I do feel that it's something that we as a developer do well, or aim to do well. We've got a very strong team and a lot of in-house capability, and we're subject to a lot of scrutiny. So these projects have to show that they've assessed the impact that they're going to have very carefully before they're deployed. The other thing I would say, and again, bearing in mind our planned trajectory here, we want to deploy fixed and floating offshore wind in ever greater scale. We have to keep data gathering, and that's connected with every project, but also just in the round as an industry, we have to keep data gathering so that we're constantly able to assess what is best practice. We work with universities and other research institutes and consultants to make sure we're constantly evaluating our approach to this and making sure that we're adopting best practice.
And beyond the scrutiny and the monitoring, can we be proactive in encouraging biodiversity around these sites?
I mean, my personal view is that we do, in the nature of what we do, and the future of environment and many species is dependent on us decarbonising. So I think that we do, almost by definition, in what we're trying to achieve by deploying renewable technology. Specifically in the case of offshore wind, I think there are opportunities then to do novel things, and that's something that we're assessing as part of our portfolio. We have an innovation team, for example, that look at where there might be opportunities to do things around our projects, and you can see that other developers are doing that too. So there's some quite novel things being done around supporting bird populations and marine life populations in a more experimental way.
Great, and tell me more about your innovation team. That sounds great.
Yeah, that's something we're proud of. It was formed early in the life of ocean winds. I think probably the core rationale is that we're constantly pushing the boundaries as a sector. If you look at some of the things we're doing in our portfolio, for example, we're using next generation wind turbine technology, pushing the boundaries of using monopiles in deeper water. So we're constantly pushing, and so it makes sense to then make sure that structurally we're looking at innovation within our business, and so that team is there to coordinate innovation activities that we're doing across the portfolio and make sure it's championed. So it looks at all different technologies, but I think one area that's particularly interesting is floating wind, where there's a lot of innovation still to come. So although we've deployed one of the largest floating projects in the world, but continual innovation is going to be needed to fully commercialise floating offshore wind. So it was right that we made sure that we had that at the core of what Ocean Winds is doing.
Great. And Adam, if some of the audience have got innovations they're desperate to get in front of you, how's the best way? How do they approach the innovation team?
I would suggest if it's a company in the UK, then engage through our team here, and we would put people in contact with the right people in the Ocean Winds team. But also they're out and about, so you tend to find them again at all the big industry events. We'll normally have people there that can make sure that we can have those sort of important early discussions and then patch people into the right bits of our team. Brilliant.
And you've mentioned the growth of Ocean Winds, which is tremendous. Are you recruiting just now?
We are. We've been growing pretty much constantly, which has been really exciting part of what we've been doing in the last few years, and we're continuing to grow. We need to prepare to take another asset in Moray West into operations, for example. So we have been continually growing, and that's an ongoing thing. Happily.
And again, if somebody wants to get their CV in front of you, that's
we're fairly easy to find on LinkedIn nowadays, because you can't miss the yellow. Also people can directly approach us, and we'll find the right person for them to speak to.
Yeah, perfect. That's good to know. Just taking a step back and thinking about this industry that we're in, and of course Ocean Winds in particular. Ocean Winds is a Portuguese-French joint venture, headquartered in Madrid, building offshore wind farms in the USA, France, Belgium, Portugal, Korea, and the UK. To me, that tells you just what a wonderful international industry this is.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's certainly something that makes this a good place to be. We've got a very international team, even just within the Edinburgh office. Naturally comes with growth. We need to be in multiple markets, but it creates a vibrant environment in the company, I think, and that the multicultural element of it makes it a good place to work.
And what was it about the UK that made Ocean Winds want to invest here?
We had a cornerstone project, so Moray East, I would say, is typically described as one of the cornerstone projects of the Ocean Winds portfolio. So we had that within the existing portfolio. That was already a joint venture between EDPR and ENGIE. So that gave us the starting point. The UK market is one of the largest, and that's through relatively long-term political support for the sector, and that's crucial now. There's now ever increasing international competition in this sector, so keeping the investment conditions right so that international investors like us continue to spend money developing and building projects is absolutely crucial. So we were in the UK market because there was seabed made available, and there was support, and that gave us the cornerstone projects. But now to build on that, we need to make sure as a country that the investment conditions stay right, and that we can keep deploying projects.
Yeah, and thinking about those investment conditions, Adam, the UK recently introduced a windfall tax. How does it affect you? How does it operate?
So that windfall tax, or electricity generator levy, taxes revenues above a certain threshold level, which is £75. So revenues that are earned above that level are subject to the tax. and that's on the basis that those revenues are considered to be exceptional revenues that couldn't have been reasonably foreseen, being that they were driven by world events that have been seen.
Okay, and how does it affect how you see the UK market?
I think at the moment, new projects, anyone looking to invest at the moment in delivering a new project faces a bit of a perfect storm. So there's massive capital cost pressures, supply chain constraint, general market uncertainty and macroeconomic pressures like high interest rates, and then merchant revenues for some projects, so high merchant power prices for some projects were an ability to mitigate against all of those cost pressures, and that ability to mitigate is to some extent being removed by the windfall tax. But we're now waiting, and possibly by the time this podcast is released, the outcome of the spring budget will be known, and so we with other developers, renewable developers, have been pressing for some mitigation to be provided in the spring budget so that the investment conditions are still right, so that we can get these projects over the line and into construction and into operation.
Great, and the UK is one of the world's largest markets for offshore wind. How do we keep the UK in that leading position? Are there any changes that you would like to see made to enable that to happen?
Yeah, it's really important that the UK doesn't rest on its laurels. So I think making sure investment conditions are right is one thing, but perhaps away from offshore wind project delivery, I think much greater ambition on how we deploy our energy networks is needed. We've historically taken a very precautionary approach to building new electricity networks in order to protect the electricity consumer, and that of course is well intentioned, but I think we need to start treating it as an emergency and building out our energy networks on an emergency footing. So that's the key change. I think there's some acceptance that that's needed, but action isn't forthcoming quickly enough. And there's some very long overdue intervention needed on how we charge for our grid, or transmission charges, or TNUoS, which people will have heard me talk about before. Long recognised issue, which has hit the headlines on a number of occasions. It's been broken. It's a piece of our energy market regulation that's been broken for a long time, and there hasn't been any action. And it's things like that need intervention and action in order to show that the UK is on the right footing to stay as a market leader.
And do you see that action is it happening? Is it taking place?
I think there's in terms of ambition on grid deployment, I think there's an acceptance of it. It's recognised, and there are some actions now being taken by government and by the regulator and by National Grid as the system operator. So there is action, and I think the right intention, but it's just that we need to get it onto an emergency footing and go faster.
Okay, great. And Adam, I'd like to find out a little bit more about you. How do you come to be UK country manager for offshore winds? Tell us about your career.
My career in 30 seconds?
Absolutely.
So I started in wave and tidal nearly 20 years ago, which was a fantastic few years, very, very cutting edge. And I ended up in wave and tidal almost by complete accident, but it was an amazing few years working on that side of the sector in Edinburgh. I then did a whistle-stop tour of different technologies, so I moved into small onshore wind, and then larger onshore wind, and then eventually the offshore wind sector over 10 years ago, and I've been here in that space since, and I've been working on the Moray Firth projects actually for nearly 10 years now.
Great, and thinking about that development of your own career, are we doing enough to get young people into our industry?
We can never do enough. I think we're doing more and more. We as a developer are, and I think the sector generally is doing more and more. The word collaboration can get overused sometimes, but I think there's been some good collaboration around skills and STEM initiatives. We're upping our game, but it is a challenge. The skills problem is going to bite us. I don't think it's only young people. I think we need to look broadly at how we bring more people and a diverse range of skills and backgrounds into our sector. So we've got to sell why people would want to work in renewables. We think it comes naturally to us. We work in renewables every day and we love it, and so it's something that we take for granted, I think. But we need to sell the sector, and we need to make sure we commit enough time to developing our next generation of workforce, or we're going to run substantially short on people, and that's going to become an issue. It is biting already, and it's going to be an escalating issue unless we really invest in it.
Absolutely. And Adam, would you have any advice for school leavers, college leavers, university leavers, forces leaders considering offshore renewables as part of their career?
Do it. I think hopefully we're showing that the only way is up for offshore wind. If nothing else, we've already deployed hundreds and hundreds of structures offshore in Scotland's waters, and that is going. Those are power stations that are going to operate for a very long time. So that already, I think we're creating a pipeline of long-term, high-quality jobs that people can have confidence will be there. So I would definitely encourage people to find a way into the sector, and I think something that comes with awarding so many new sites across Round 4 in England and Wales and Scotland is that the range of different opportunities to get into the sector, I think, is now much greater. It was maybe previously seen as predominantly a career for engineers, but I don't think that's the case, certainly not anymore. So I think people from any sort of disciplinary background and qualification can find their opportunities. So I would encourage people to do it. And so get on LinkedIn, find where the opportunities are, and go for it.
Absolutely. So these are commercial roles, technical roles, and more.
Everything and more. Yeah. So the larger projects and the larger developers, the true broad businesses. So it's harder to come up with skills that we don't need than skills that we do. It's a really, really broad range of roles.
That's great. And Adam, tell me, how as the country manager for the UK, how do you define success for the organisation that you lead?
A key success factor for us is safely deploying and operating our projects. And the word safety has to come first. What we do is diverse, and there are a lot of risks, particularly, but not only when you look at the offshore construction aspect, but we're dealing with water, electricity, excavation, everything. So we have to put safety at the front of it, and the safety of our people is always going to be top of my list personally. But then we're here to deploy and operate projects and to maximise the performance of our wind farms. So those are sort of top of my list. But I think that there's a huge number of success factors underneath the bonnet of that, and continuing to grow and develop our team, I think, is then always going to be core to that. If we don't keep growing our team and developing it, then we'll not be successful.
Right, and as a successful guy in the industry, Adam, how do you define success for yourself personally?
That's a very tricky question. For me, I think working with good people on something I enjoy, and something that's varied as well. So in my current role, it's very varied, and that definitely makes me tick. And it's certainly something that offshore wind offers generally. Great deal of variety from one day to the next. You never quite know what some of these projects are going to throw at you from one day to the next. So that motivates me personally. And then more broadly, health and happiness of my family, of course.
Great, excellent stuff. Adam, in each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests to leave us with a question for the next guest without actually knowing who they are. The last podcast we recorded, episode 12, was with Alan McCaskill. He's the co-founder and chief technical officer of Flotation Energy. And Alan left us with this. How do we get power all the way from the wind farm to the consumer? How do we improve the processes of getting the grid connection so we can supply energy to the people?
So Alan mustn't have known then that it was going to be an electrical engineer fielding that question, who's commonly on his soapbox about all of those things. So how long have you got? We've probably covered this slightly already. It's a well-known problem, and it's a very nuanced problem as well, because there's historic bits of regulation, there's supply chain constraints, there's how you make sure the consumer is protected while we spend a lot of money on all of this, because we will need to spend a lot of money on it, and we need to be prepared as a society, I think, to invest. So it's a very nuanced problem. I'll try and bundle it up into a soundbite that I think it needs to be on an emergency footing. I'm quite convinced that society will see the benefit of investing in our energy networks. Historically it has. I think people, particularly in rural parts of the country, recognise the societal benefit of having energy networks, energy security, jobs. So I think I'm convinced it will be low regret for us to invest in our energy networks on an emergency footing, and so that's the footing I think it needs to be on.
Absolutely. And Adam, ahead of today's interview, I asked you to set a question for our next guest. What is it?
I'm hoping that this will be a slightly tricky one, because it's a difficult topic. Like we've talked about, the scale of the supply chain opportunities that are stimulated by our offshore wind sector are huge. And I mentioned to you that I think that project developers like us have the will to make things happen, to make some really exciting things happen. But how do we make that happen in practical terms? What practical steps do we need to take so that we deliver on the scale of that opportunity?
Great. So what practical steps can we take to deliver on the opportunity? And is that specifically around Scotland, or are we looking at the whole?
I think it's broader than that. So ScotWind and Round 4 have provided the new leasing opportunities, but I think we should view it more broadly than that. There were existing projects that have still to be built. There are other technologies as well, like onshore wind, for example. Potential for development of large-scale hydrogen industry. There are other technologies in the mix as well, and so it's the collective of all of that should create some really exciting opportunities. But in practical terms, how do we get those supply chain opportunities delivered on?
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I look forward to asking the question and to hearing the answers too. So that brings us to the end of today's interview. Adam, I'd like to thank you, Adam Morrison, Country Manager for the UK for Ocean Winds, for joining the podcast today.
Thanks very much.
And as always, feedback on today's podcast would be most welcome. Feel free to suggest who we should feature in future episodes. What questions do you want to ask the leaders of the energy transition? So get in touch. LinkedIn's a good way. You can find me on there, or by email, it's Moray, that's Moray, at annetconsulting.com. Thank you very much.